Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. There are cases among the many I have chronicled of my dear friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, which, even now, I hesitate to recount. Not for fear of public disbelief, for Holmes's fame has long dispelled the need for such caution, but because there are certain truths so entangled with personal sorrow, so steeped in wounds never fully healed, that to expose them feels almost a betrayal. Yet conscience, like the tide, wears steadily against the walls we build within ourselves. And so it is, after many years of silence, I find my pen drawn to the only case Holmes forbade me to record. It was not a matter of national consequence, nor a puzzle whose intricacy defied all reason. No, its weight lay not in its complexity, but in its intimacy. Holmes had often declared that his powers were at their keenest when his emotions were least engaged. And yet, in this singular instance, I saw how even the most disciplined mind can falter when forced to confront the ghosts of its own past. I write these words not for the public press, nor for the curious student of Holmes' methods. I write them only for myself, and perhaps for the man who once sat opposite me, beneath the glow of the Baker Street lamp, his fingers steepled in contemplation, his mind locked in a battle against a spectre only he could see. This, then, is the story of the one case Holmes could never truly solve, not because the facts eluded him, but because the price of understanding was too high to bear. It was upon a night such as this, rain lashing against the windows, the wind howling through the narrow street, that the matter first presented itself. Holmes had been unusually silent throughout the day, his violin lying untouched upon the table, his pipe unsmoked at his elbow. There was a weight about him, a brooding stillness I could not account for, though I had long ceased to question such moods when they descended upon him. Outside, the lamps cast feeble halos through the mist, and the fire in our grate seemed powerless to dispel the chill that pervaded the room. Holmes sat in his chair, fingers clasped beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the far wall, though I do not believe he saw it. His mind had withdrawn somewhere beyond my reach, and I found myself reluctant to break the silence. Such moments were not uncommon, but there was a difference this time, a heaviness, as though the very air carried the weight of some approaching storm. And in truth, that storm arrived not from the street, nor from the sky, but in the form of a knock upon the door, a knock that would summon Holmes to face not only a new case, but a ghost from his own past. The knock was soft, but insistent. 3 quick raps followed by a pause, then 2 more. Holmes's eyes flickered to the door, and in that instant I saw it. The faint tightening of his jaw, the subtle shift in his posture. Whatever he had anticipated, this was not it. "Mrs. Hudson," he called, his voice sharp enough to startle me. "If you please." Our landlady appeared almost at once, her face drawn with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "A lady, sir," she said. Veiled and very pale. She would not give her name. Holmes rose swiftly, his composure returned in an instant. "Show her in." The woman who entered carried herself with the grace of one accustomed to privilege, yet that grace was undone by the trembling of her gloved hands and the slight unsteadiness of her step. She remained standing, though Holmes gestured toward a chair. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice scarcely above a whisper, "I have come to you because there is no one else. If you refuse me, I shall be dead within the week." The room, already cold, seemed to grow colder still. Holmes said nothing at first, but I saw his gaze sharpen, taking in every detail, the fine fabric of her dress, the absence of any jewellery, the mud upon her hem. But it was her eyes that held him, wide, dark, and unmistakably haunted. "Pray, madam," he said at last, "be seated, and tell me everything." From the folds of her cloak, the woman produced a single scrap of paper. Its edges were torn, the surface stained dark with what could only be dried blood. Holmes took it with the utmost delicacy, holding it between thumb and forefinger as he examined the writing. A set of coordinates, numbers and degrees, precise and stark. Beneath them, a name, scrawled in ink, but crossed out with violent strokes of red, as though the very mention of it had become unbearable. The paper emitted a faint but unmistakable scent. Holmes lifted it closer to his nose, his expression unreadable. "Gunpowder," he said softly. The woman's hands twisted in her lap. "That paper was slipped beneath my door 2 nights ago," she said. "I did not understand its meaning, but I knew it was a warning." Holmes turned abruptly toward the window, though what he saw there I could not guess. "This name," he said, "does it belong to a man you knew?" The woman hesitated. "To a man I loved." For the first and only time in our long acquaintance, I saw Sherlock Holmes hesitate. He laid the paper upon the table and took a single step back, as though recoiling from some invisible force. His face, always so composed, had paled slightly, and his hands, so often steady, had closed into fists. "I cannot take this case," he said. The words stunned me. I had seen Holmes pursue the most hopeless of causes, the most dangerous of villains, without flinching. And yet here he stood, unwilling, not from lack of interest, but from something far deeper. The woman's voice broke. "If you refuse me, I am lost." For a moment, Holmes said nothing. Then, with a visible effort, he regained control. "Very well," he said. "I will help you." But the weight of that decision hung heavy in the air, and I knew, even before the first clue had been examined, that this case would be unlike any other. She left us shortly after, her veil drawn tightly once more, leaving Holmes and me alone in the silence she had shattered. I expected Holmes to spring into action, to summon the cab, to review his books, to dictate some swift plan of inquiry. Instead, he remained by the fire, staring into the flames. "Holmes," I ventured at last, "what is it about this case that troubles you so?" He did not turn. "There are ghosts in every man's past, Watson," he said quietly. "Most have the courtesy to remain buried." I could draw no further answer from him that night. But as we retired, I could not shake the sense that the woman's life, and perhaps Holmes's own peace, now hung upon a single, blood-stained scrap of paper. The game had begun, but this time the stakes were higher than any I had known. It was well after midnight when we set out, the coordinates clutched in Holmes's gloved hand, the gas lamps of Baker Street fading behind us as our carriage rattled into the night. The air was thick with fog, curling through the streets like something half alive, muting the sound of the horses' hooves, until it seemed we travelled through a world emptied of all but the two of us. Holmes had scarcely spoken since the veiled woman's departure, and even I, long accustomed to his silences, felt the weight of his introspection more keenly than usual. He sat with his chin buried in his scarf, the brim of his hat pulled low, but I could see the tension in his hands where they rested upon his knees, fingers curled slightly, as though grasping at something just out of reach. The carriage turned sharply, and through the veil of fog emerged the shape of a house, tall, gaunt, and miserable, its upper windows like blind eyes gazing into the dark. The sight of it made Holmes draw breath sharply, though he spoke not a word. "Holmes," I ventured, "you know this place." He turned his face from me, watching the house as though it might vanish if his eyes left it. "I know it," he said at last, "and it knows me." There was something chilling in the way he spoke, something that raised the hair at the nape of my neck. I pressed no further, for the house itself seemed to draw closer, its broken gate swinging loose, its garden overgrown into a tangle of skeletal branches. And so, with neither word nor hesitation, we stepped down from the carriage and into the fog-drenched silence. The door gave way with little more than a touch, swinging inward with a groan that echoed down the long, empty hall. Our lantern threw trembling light across cracked tiles and warped wood, revealing a house long abandoned to dust and decay. Holmes moved ahead without pause, his sharp gaze sweeping the floor, the walls, the very air itself. I followed more cautiously, every footstep stirring up the scent of damp earth and old wood. It was in the study, a small room off the main hall, where Holmes came to an abrupt halt. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, gesturing to the floor. In the thick layer of dust lay a single footprint, fresh, distinct, and terribly out of place. Beside it, partially obscured, was a stain upon the floorboards, dark as rust, and long since dried. "Blood?" I asked. Holmes gave a noncommittal hum and knelt to examine the mark. His hands moved with their usual precision, but I could see the slight stiffness in his shoulders, as though the act itself stirred some uncomfortable memory. From the hearth, half buried beneath a heap of ash, Holmes withdrew a small brass key, tarnished but still intact. "It was left deliberately," he murmured. "But for whom?" Before I could ask what he meant, Holmes pocketed the key and moved toward the window, where the glass was still intact, but clouded with years of grime. His reflection stared back at him, thin and sharp, blending almost indistinguishably with the shadows. "Why would anyone return to this place after so long?" I asked. "Because some doors," Holmes said softly, "once opened, refused to close." There was an almost imperceptible tremor in his voice, a rare faltering in the man I had known for so long to be made of iron logic and relentless detachment. Something about this place had touched him deeply, too deeply for me to understand just yet. We continued our search, lantern light licking at the walls as we moved deeper into the house. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of ancient wood beneath our feet and the soft tap of Holmes's cane against the floor. It was Watson who first saw it. The portrait, half concealed by a torn curtain, its subject staring out with a face brutally slashed by some blade or sharp instrument. The gouges were not random. They cut straight through the eyes, as though the very gaze of the figure had become intolerable to whoever had wielded the knife. "Holmes," I said softly. This was deliberate. Holmes stepped forward, studying the mutilated canvas with a peculiar expression I could not decipher. "A face someone could not bear to see," he said, "or perhaps a face that could not be allowed to look back." As we stood there, a faint scent drifted through the air, delicate, floral, strangely out of place in the stale and rotting house. I sniffed again. Jasmine. Holmes froze. For the briefest moment, his composure cracked, and his eyes flicked sharply toward the hall beyond. Without a word, he strode forward, following the scent like a hound on a scent trail. I hurried after him, my heart quickening with every step. The perfume seemed strongest near the stairs, where the air felt heavier, as though the house itself held its breath. Holmes paused at the foot of the staircase, his face once again a mask of icy control. "There is something here, Watson," he said, his voice low. "Something, or someone, who has waited a very long time." And with that, he began to ascend, each step creaking beneath his weight, the darkness above swallowing him whole. We returned to Baker Street in silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken thoughts. Holmes busied himself at the sideboard, his back to me, while I took my seat opposite his empty chair. The brass key lay upon the table, catching the dim light of the gas lamp, and I found myself staring at it as though it might unlock not only a door, but the secrets Holmes so carefully concealed. After some minutes, Holmes rang for a messenger and scribbled a note in his precise hand. When I inquired after its recipient, he merely said, "Lestrade." That was all. It was close to noon when the inspector arrived, his usual air of brusque efficiency tempered with a wary curiosity. Holmes wasted no time in pleasantries. "Inspector, I would have your recollection of a certain house, a manor in the outskirts, long abandoned." Lestrade's smile flickered, but his expression hardened the moment Holmes named the property. He settled into his chair with a measured breath, fingers drumming the armrest. 30 years ago," said Lestrade. "That house was at the centre of a scandal the Yard was ordered to forget. A duel, illegal of course, fought in the dead of night on those very grounds. The participants were both men of note, but one in particular stood out. A young man, scarcely more than a student, who had already made himself inconveniently brilliant." I glanced at Holmes, but his face was a mask of indifference. "Sherlock Holmes," Lestrade continued, "stood witness to the duel. More than that, if the whispers were true, he arranged it. A man died on those grounds, and the matter was buried deeper than any grave." He paused, as if awaiting some denial from Holmes. None came. "Inspector," I said, struggling to reconcile what I had heard with the man beside me, "what was the duel fought over?" Lestrade shook his head. "That, Doctor, has remained a mystery. But I never forgot the name of that house, and neither, I suspect, has your friend." Once Lestrade had gone, silence settled over the room like a shroud. Holmes stood by the window, gazing out at the rain-slicked streets below. For several minutes, I waited, willing him to speak, to offer some rational explanation, some thread to pull at the tangled knot that had formed in my mind. "Holmes," I said at last, "you owe me the truth." He turned slowly, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes held the same unreadable depth I had seen when first I met him. "No, Watson," he said quietly, "there are truths I owe no one." It was not a rebuke, nor was it an evasion. It was a rare glimpse into a part of Holmes's life I had never been permitted to enter, a place where logic bowed to memory, and memory to regret. I asked no further questions. There was something in his voice I had never heard before, and I dared not press against the door he had so firmly closed. I am not proud of what I did next. Had Holmes been more forthcoming, had he offered even the smallest fragment of explanation, I might have left the matter to rest. But his silence gnawed at me until my curiosity took on the weight of duty. Under the pretense of an errand, I returned alone to the manor. The air inside seemed colder than before, as though the house had drawn breath and held it, waiting for my return. I retraced our steps to the study, my lantern flickering against the damp walls. It was mere chance, or so I told myself, that my hand brushed against a seam in the panelling near the hearth. The wood gave slightly under my fingers, and with careful pressure, a narrow compartment slid open. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, its seal long broken. My heart pounded as I withdrew the folded paper. The letter bore no date, no salutation, only a brief message scrawled in a hand I did not know. It was addressed directly to Holmes, and at its foot stood a single initial, M. There was no need for me to speculate. The letter belonged to Holmes, and though I could not guess its meaning, I knew I held a piece of the puzzle he had hoped would never be found. I placed the letter into Holmes's hand the moment I returned. His fingers closed around it with a strange reluctance, and though his expression was unreadable, I detected the faintest tremor in his grip. He unfolded the paper, read it silently, and for the first time in all our years together, I saw Sherlock Holmes look afraid. He said nothing at first. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Then, at last, he spoke. "Burn it, Watson. At once." There was no trace of explanation, no plea for understanding. It was not a request. It was an order. And though every instinct within me cried out against it, I obeyed. I struck a match, touched it to the corner of the paper, and watched as the flame consumed whatever secrets the letter might have held. Holmes stood watching, his face illuminated by the flickering light, and for a fleeting moment I saw something in him I had never seen before. Not fear of discovery, but the weariness of a man who has carried a burden too long. I said nothing. Some silences, I had learned, are meant to remain unbroken. The morning following our unsettling visit to the manor, Holmes and I undertook a deeper inquiry into the veiled woman's history. Though my companion preserved his customary air of detached inquiry, I could not mistake the heightened sharpness of his questioning, nor the care with which he sifted each reply for some invisible thread. It was as though the case had shifted in his mind from a matter of professional interest to one of private urgency. Through the records we obtained, and the reluctant admissions of certain well-placed acquaintances, we uncovered a revelation which, had I not seen Holmes's face remain so grimly composed, might have struck me as improbable melodrama. The veiled woman had once been engaged to none other than the man slain in the infamous duel that had so clouded Holmes's past. Her intended was a man of standing and fortune who had fallen into scandal shortly before his death, though the nature of that disgrace had been quietly suppressed. What chilled me more than the mere fact of her connection was her own declaration, made in a letter addressed to Holmes a fortnight before she appeared at Baker Street. In that letter, she swore that her dead fiancé had returned, his voice whispering through locked doors, his shadow passing beneath her window. Messages, unmistakably in his hand, had appeared upon her dressing table, phrases they alone had shared. "This is madness," I said to Holmes as we walked along the embankment, the paper folded tightly in his grip. "Some cruel hoax, or a trick played upon a grieving mind." Holmes did not answer at once. When he spoke, his voice was low. "There are no ghosts, Watson, but the living, when properly motivated, are infinitely more terrifying." He said no more, but the set of his jaw, the uncharacteristic pallor of his face, told me this was no ordinary case. For the first time in our long acquaintance, I suspected Holmes feared not merely the crime, but the possibility that some corner of his own past might rise to greet him. That afternoon, we made our way to the woman's residence, a narrow house of good address in South Kensington. The curtains were drawn tightly across the upper windows, and the maid who admitted us did so with an air of palpable relief, as though our arrival might dispel some lurking presence. Holmes set to work at once, questioning each member of the household with his usual blend of precision and quiet authority. The answers we received painted a picture as strange as any Gothic tale. Footsteps had been heard pacing outside the mistress's chamber in the dead of night, slow and deliberate, though no one was ever seen. Doors opened and closed of their own accord. The library clock, which had stood silent for years, began to chime at irregular intervals, always at the hour the duel had taken place. Most troubling of all was the description given by the upstairs maid, who swore she had twice seen a figure standing in the garden below her window. A tall man, dressed as gentlemen had dressed some 30 years before, motionless and watching the house. The face, she said, was shrouded in shadow, but the posture, the slight tilt of the head, was unmistakably that of the dead fiancé. Holmes listened to each account without comment, though I could see his mind working furiously behind his calm exterior. He paced the hall, pausing at intervals to run his hand along the woodwork, or to inspect the seams where wall met floor. At one point, he asked for a candle and held the flame near the lock of the mistress's chamber door, observing with interest the faintest trace of oil. A sign the lock had been recently turned, though the key lay undisturbed upon her bedside table. "It is an elaborate fiction," I whispered as we descended the stairs. "A cruel game designed to break her mind." Holmes shook his head. "Fiction leaves room for error. This has been executed with precision. There is a mind at work here, Watson. A mind well versed in fear and in the art of exploiting it." He said no more, but the grim set of his features suggested he knew, or at least suspected, who that mind belonged to. It would be dishonest of me to suggest that I shared Holmes' cold certainty. Though I had stood beside him through countless investigations, always placing my faith in reason and deduction, the atmosphere surrounding this case had begun to wear upon my nerves. The house, with its drawn curtains and whispering corridors, seemed imbued with a presence neither of us could entirely dispel. That night, As we sat once more in Baker Street, I voiced what had been troubling me since our visit. "Holmes," I said, "what if there is no rational solution? What if, just this once, we are confronted with something that defies logic?" He smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "A ghost, Watson. Shall I summon a medium and hold hands around a table?" I bristled at his condescension, though I knew it to be his habit when confronted with sentiment. "You have seen what I have seen," I pressed. "Can you explain the footsteps, the figure in the garden, the writing in the dead man's hand?" "A ghost leaves no footprints," Holmes said quietly. "A ghost leaves no trace of oil upon a lock, nor disturbs a carpet in passing. No, my dear fellow, the answer lies not in the supernatural, but in the all-too-human desire for vengeance." I knew better than to argue, but some part of me remained unconvinced. For all Holmes's brilliance, there were mysteries that could not be solved by mere observation. And though I did not say it aloud, I could not shake the sensation that we were walking into the shadow of something far darker than any earthly crime. There are cases in our long association, recorded and unrecorded alike, where Holmes's brilliance seemed to illuminate the whole of a mystery with a single spark. This was not one of them. Each fact we uncovered seemed to darken the matter rather than clarify it, until I could no longer discern if we pursued a solution or merely chased shadows. It was during our second visit to the lady's house that the first of these shadows took shape in the form of a name, a former suitor dismissed from her life many years before. He was a physician of some reputation in his day, though that reputation had tarnished with whispers of experiments conducted beyond the ethical boundaries of his profession. Rumor spoke of rare poisons, undetectable by ordinary methods, and of a certain fascination with the effects of prolonged psychological torment. The second figure emerged from the household itself, a housekeeper dismissed under peculiar circumstances shortly after the death of the lady's fiancé. The records were thin, but a few well-placed inquiries revealed she had been caught listening at doors, intercepting letters, and speaking in hushed tones to a man none of the other servants could identify. Holmes listened to these revelations with the same impassive face he wore before any particularly complex puzzle, though I noticed a tightening about his mouth whenever the jewel was mentioned. These figures, these ghosts from the lady's past, were all too real, but I could not escape the sense that Holmes regarded them as distractions rather than answers. I pressed him for his opinion, but he would only say, "Watson, the hand that leaves a glove at a crime scene rarely belongs to the guilty party." It was an odd remark at the time, but one whose significance would soon become painfully clear. It was not only the case itself that weighed heavily upon me, but the uncharacteristic way in which Holmes approached it. He dismissed both the physician and the housekeeper as suspects almost immediately, though he offered no reasoning for his conclusions. When I demanded to know why, he merely smiled, a smile I could not help but find irritating in its quiet superiority. "Some matters, Watson, are clearer from a distance than when viewed too closely," he said. "Let us leave these ghosts to rest." I could not accept that. For years I had stood at his side, witnessing his methods, learning his habits, and trusting his instincts, even when my own had failed me. But now, for the first time, I began to feel as though I were being deliberately excluded, not from the facts, but from their meaning. Holmes was playing a game I did not understand, and the rules were his alone to know. It was a subtle strain at first. No raised voices, no angry words, but between us stretched a silence more uncomfortable than any argument could have been. I had long considered our partnership unbreakable, but at that moment, I began to wonder if Holmes feared that the truth, once found, might cost him more than the case itself. We had agreed to keep a close watch upon the lady's house, and at Holmes's insistence, I took the first watch outside her bedroom door. Holmes himself remained below, pacing the drawing room like a caged animal, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. There was something restless in him that night, a quality I could not quite name, something between anxiety and anticipation. The hours crept past in heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of a distant clock. I heard no movement within her room, no sound to suggest disturbance, and it was with some relief that I rose to wake Holmes as midnight approached, certain that no harm had come to her. That certainty died the instant I opened her door. The bed was empty, the sheets drawn back as though their occupant had risen calmly and of her own volition. The window stood ajar, a thin curtain stirring in the night air. On the sill lay a single red glove, fingers curled inward like a beckoning hand. Embedded in the wood beside it was a silver bullet, half buried in the frame. A bullet of peculiar design, smaller than any ordinary round, and polished to a mirror-like gleam. I called Holmes at once, and he arrived within seconds, his face unreadable as he surveyed the scene. He made no exclamation, no expression of surprise, only that tightening about his mouth, the familiar mark of thought compressed into silence. "She did not leave alone," he said at last, "nor was she taken by force." It was a cryptic remark, but before I could demand further explanation, Holmes turned sharply on his heel and descended the stairs 2 at a time. Whatever theory had taken shape in his mind, I knew only that time was no longer a luxury we possessed. Once we returned to Baker Street, Holmes lit his pipe with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. I had seen him thus only twice before, once after the affair of the Reigate Squire, and once again following the tragedy at Baskerville Hall. It was the look of a man calculating the cost of a truth not yet spoken. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is something I must tell you." I braced myself for some revelation about the case, some twist of deduction that had eluded me. But what followed was far more troubling. "We have 48 hours to find her," he said, "and if we fail, her life will not be the only one forfeit." There was something in his tone, a finality I could not mistake. "Holmes," I said, "what hold does this case have upon you?" He shook his head. "No questions, old friend, not yet." I could not press him. There was a weight upon him that I could neither share nor lessen, a burden whose roots lay far deeper than this present mystery. And so, in silence, we prepared for whatever the next day might bring, though I feared the answer lay not in what we might uncover, but in what Holmes already knew. It was with evident reluctance that Holmes laid out his plan to me, though its brilliance was beyond dispute. I had long since learned that his capacity to weave deception when necessary was nearly as formidable as his skill in untangling it. On this occasion, he proposed nothing less than a theatrical seance, an elaborate ruse designed to exploit the fear already infecting every mind connected to this case. "Superstition, Watson," he said, "is the shortest path to confession. When reason fails, fear will often speak in its place." The invitation was dispatched to all parties: the veiled woman, her household, the physician, the former housekeeper, and Inspector Lestrade himself, under the pretense that Holmes had unearthed new evidence demanding immediate confrontation at the manor. What none of them knew, save myself, was that Holmes intended to summon not evidence, but a ghost. We arrived well after dark, the house standing silent against the sky, its windows black and unwelcoming. Holmes arranged the chairs in a circle in the very study where the duel had ended all those years ago. A small table stood at the centre, upon it a single candle, a glass, and a folded scrap of the blood-stained paper the woman had brought to Baker Street. "Your role, Watson," Holmes instructed, "is simple: disbelief. The others must believe we have stumbled into something beyond our understanding. Let your doubts be known, but not too forcefully." I confess, I was ill at ease with the deception. Yet Holmes's face, drawn and serious, left no room for argument. Whatever truth he hoped to draw out, it was one he considered worth the risk of dishonesty. And so, as the guests filed into the room, taking their seats with visible unease, I braced myself for whatever darkness Holmes intended to conjure. The candle flickered, casting restless shadows upon the walls, as the storm gathered strength outside. Holmes, seated at the head of the circle, placed both hands flat upon the table and lowered his head. His voice, when it came, was low and measured. "We call upon the spirit of the man who died within these walls," he intoned. "We call upon the soul who cannot rest." It was preposterous, absurd even, to hear such words from Sherlock Holmes, and yet the atmosphere had grown so charged with unease that not one of us dared interrupt. Holmes's voice changed as he spoke, his usual clipped precision softening into something unfamiliar, almost languid, as though some other voice had mingled with his own. He spoke names, pet names, intimate words Watson knew had passed only between the veiled woman and her fiancé. He recited lines from letters long since burned, phrases no living soul could have known. I glanced at the woman and saw her hands trembling, her lips soundlessly forming the very words Holmes spoke aloud. The wind battered the windows, rattling the panes like restless fingers. The candle guttered, nearly dying before flaring anew. Holmes's head snapped upright, his eyes gleaming unnaturally in the half-light. "Who betrayed me?" he demanded, the voice no longer his own. "Who turned friend to foe and drove me to my death?" The woman shrieked. The housekeeper covered her mouth. Even Lestrade, that veteran of countless grisly crimes, paled visibly. And I, who had stood beside Holmes in the face of countless dangers, found myself doubting, if only for a moment, that I knew my friend at all. "Speak!" Holmes thundered, and the door at the rear of the room creaked open of its own accord. The door swung wide, and in the gaping darkness beyond it, a figure stood, a man, tall and gaunt, with a pistol trembling in his hand. His face, though aged and drawn, bore the unmistakable features of the man who had fallen in the duel 30 years before. The veiled woman gave a strangled cry and fell to her knees, trembling violently. Lestrade half rose from his chair, his hand already reaching for his revolver, but Holmes raised his hand in a gesture of command, his expression unreadable. The man stepped forward into the light, and I saw that his hand shook, not from fear, but from rage barely held in check. His voice, when he spoke, was cracked with age, but fierce with purpose. "Who dares summon me here?" he demanded. "Who calls upon the dead?" Holmes rose slowly, his gaze fixed on the man as though confirming some long-held suspicion. "No ghost you, sir," he said quietly. "The dead do not carry firearms." The man's grip faltered for a moment, and Holmes stepped forward, unafraid, until they stood only feet apart. "Your tricks are clever," Holmes said. "But not clever enough. You returned not for vengeance, but for something far more valuable, something only she could give you." The man's eyes flicked toward the veiled woman, and I saw in that glance the whole of his desperate purpose. It was not hatred that had drawn him back to this house, but need, urgent, consuming, and entirely human. Before I could make sense of it all, Holmes turned to the others, his voice regaining its usual clarity. "Gentlemen, we have been chasing a ghost, but the true spectre here is not the man who died, but the brother who lived." With that, the pistol dropped from the man's hand, clattering to the floor, and Holmes, with all the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, said, "Welcome home, Colonel." Holmes stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the trembling man before us. "There are no ghosts in this house," he said quietly. "There never were." The veiled woman, still crouched beside the table, gave a soft moan of disbelief. But Holmes pressed on. "You were made to believe otherwise because fear was the only tool left to break you. When logic could not compel you to reveal the truth, terror became the only lever strong enough to prise open your mind." He turned to the assembled company, his voice now for all to hear. "The footsteps, the midnight figure, the letters written in the dead man's hand. All of it was nothing more than the careful work of a mind well versed in fear. The handwriting was imitated by one who knew it intimately. The figure in the garden wore clothes preserved from the day of the duel. And the sounds, the pacing, the doors opening, were the product of wires and weights, no different from those found in the workings of a common stage magician. Lestrade snorted. Trickery, then. Indeed, Holmes replied. But not the work of a common swindler. No, this was a design of much greater subtlety, a deliberate campaign of psychological ruin meant not simply to frighten, but to compel. The veiled woman stared at Holmes, her eyes wide with incomprehension. But why? What purpose could such cruelty serve? Holmes gave the faintest sigh. Because there is something only you know, madam. Something inherited, perhaps, or entrusted to you before your fiancé's death. A secret so dangerous that someone was willing to drive you to madness in order to extract it. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers curling around a pendant she had worn since the day we met her. Holmes's eyes followed the motion, and I saw the flash of understanding pass between them. Whatever secret she held, it lay not in her memory alone, but in something she carried. It was then that Holmes turned back to the man who had stepped from the shadows, the figure we had all believed to be the ghost of the dead fiancé. You knew, Holmes said softly, because you were no ghost at all. You were the man's brother. The room fell silent. The veiled woman stared at him in horror. No, she whispered. That cannot be. Holmes shook his head. It is the only answer that fits the facts. You were told your brother had died abroad, a victim of some colonial fever. But that was a convenient lie. In truth, he disappeared because he could no longer be trusted. He turned to the man, his voice sharpening. You served in Her Majesty's interests, or so your superiors believed, until they discovered you had sold information to the highest bidder. You vanished into the wilds of Central Asia, where such men go to either be forgotten or to rebuild themselves under new names. The man's silence was damning. You did not return for your sister, Holmes continued. You returned for the cipher your brother concealed before his death. A code, perhaps hidden within a piece of jewellery or a family letter, which holds the key to a network of agents still embedded deep within the Russian frontier. At this, the veiled woman clutched the pendant at her throat once more, her face draining of colour. Holmes's gaze did not waver. The great game, Holmes said softly. Even from beyond the grave it is played. Your brother's death may have silenced his voice, but his secrets remained, and you, madam, became their unwitting guardian. The man's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of revelation. Whatever secrets he had hoped to claim had now slipped through his fingers. For once Holmes spoke a thing aloud. It was as good as carved in stone. The room had emptied when Holmes finally spoke to me alone. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the study, and Holmes's gaze rested not upon me, but upon the flames. There is something I must tell you, Watson, he said, his voice quiet. I waited, for there was no need to press him. Whatever burden he carried had festered long enough, and now at last it had risen to the surface. The duel, he said, was never about honour. It was about silence. He rose, pacing the room with restless energy. I knew of the brothers' treachery long before the duel was fought. I knew, and I kept silent, not for his sake, but for the sake of the larger game. Exposing him would have unravelled an entire web of British intelligence, and so I allowed the duel to serve as his execution. He paused at the window, his hands clasped behind his back. I made that choice believing it was necessary, but necessity and justice are seldom the same. I rose, laying a hand upon his shoulder. You were young, I said. You did what you thought was right. Holmes shook his head. There are debts, Watson, that cannot be paid, only carried. He said no more. We stood in silence, two old friends in a room grown suddenly too small to contain all that had been said, and all that remained unspoken. We sat once more in our familiar chairs at Baker Street, the fire murmuring quietly between us. Outside, The rain pattered against the window panes, and for some moments Holmes seemed content to let the sound fill the silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I had seen him in such moods before, a mind winding down from its highest pitch, but there was a weight upon him now, something almost contemplative that was unlike him. "Let us draw the threads together, Watson," he said at last, "for if this case has been clouded by shadows, it is only because its pieces lay scattered over 30 years and more." He began, as he always did, with the first and simplest of clues. The jasmine perfume, detected so faintly at the manor, had not been applied to mask the air, but to mask something far more distinct. "There is," Holmes said, "a very particular smell to aged gunpowder, a clinging, acrid scent that no amount of years can entirely erase. The jasmine served only to cloak what the nose might otherwise remember." The slashed portrait, too, revealed its own story. "The hand that destroyed that face," Holmes continued, "was the same hand that fired the fatal shot 30 years ago, a hand that could not abide to see itself immortalized upon canvas." The blood-stained scrap of paper, the first object placed into Holmes's hand, bore coordinates that led them to the house itself, a house chosen not for its convenience, but for its history. That house, Watson, was no ordinary home. It was a meeting ground, a secret hall for men who traded in whispers, maps, and coded reports long before our own government even knew the full shape of their operations. Every element, from the veiled woman's terrified letters to the staged haunting, formed part of a cruelly deliberate design, a design meant to unearth something hidden within her very possession, passed down unknowingly from the man who had died in the duel. "It was never about vengeance alone," Holmes said quietly. "It was about finding what her fiancé carried to his grave, the key to a secret long sought but never found. Years before I met you, Watson," Holmes continued, "I found myself drawn into affairs that even now I would hesitate to call police work. This was at a time when my reputation, such as it was, had yet to solidify, and when certain men in high places found my peculiar talents of interest. It was during those years that Holmes first came to the manor, summoned not to solve a crime, but to prevent one. The house, innocuous to the world at large, had been a clandestine gathering point for what Holmes described as a nameless fraternity. Men who trafficked not in money or property, but in intelligence. They were the shadows behind the great game, the quiet war fought in deserts and mountains far from London's comfort. The duel itself, Holmes explained, was no common affair of jealousy or wounded pride. It was a purge. The man who died, beloved fiancé to the woman now at the centre of our case, had been entrusted with a cipher, a single scrap of code that could expose or protect an entire network of agents embedded deep within Central Asia. When suspicions arose that he intended to defect, the fraternity demanded action. "I did not merely witness that duel, Watson," Holmes said softly. "I arranged it." For the briefest moment, I could find no words. That Holmes had been a party to such deadly affairs, long before his career of public brilliance, was nearly inconceivable to me. Yet here he sat, the weight of 30 years resting heavily upon him. The coordinates on the blood-stained paper were no accident. They had led us back to the very ground where all had begun, the ground Holmes himself had chosen when there had been no other path forward. "It was a house of secrets, Watson," he said, "and some houses do not let their ghosts rest quietly. I had always believed, perhaps naively, that I knew the essential sum of Sherlock Holmes, that his life before Baker Street had been but a prelude to the brilliance I was privileged to record. But that night, as he told me the final truth, I realized how much I had never known and would never fully understand. The man who had haunted the veiled woman, the man Holmes unmasked not as a ghost, but as her own brother, had known Holmes before I did. They had stood upon that duelling ground together, not as enemies, but as reluctant allies bound by a single cause. Holmes had arranged the duel not simply to silence a defector, but to save a compromised network, to cauterize a wound before it could fester. And so, Holmes said. I watched one man die, and I watched the other vanish, presumed lost to fever or misfortune somewhere beyond the Khyber Pass. But the dead, as Holmes had reminded me time and again, have a way of returning when least expected. The brother had not died. He had survived and rebuilt himself under a dozen false names, always circling closer to the one prize he could not abandon, the cipher entrusted to his brother before the end. To claim it, he had needed his sister, not merely for what she knew, but for what she had unknowingly possessed all along. Holmes shook his head. I underestimated him, Watson. I believed 30 years had buried the past. I believed the great game, once played, had ended. He reached for his pipe, but his hand hesitated. I was wrong. I sat silently, knowing there was nothing I could say to ease the weight Holmes carried. I could only record the truth, even if that truth would never see publication. For in this case, Holmes had not only solved a crime, he had unearthed the man he had once been, and the price he had paid to become what he was. Some mysteries, I realized, were not meant for the world. They were meant for a single firelit room, shared between two old friends, until time itself carried them into silence. For some time after Holmes had laid bare the final truth of the case, neither of us spoke. I had witnessed him untangle many webs in our long acquaintance, yet never before had I seen him approach the conclusion of a case with such measured reluctance, as though each word required extraction by force of will. I have told you, Watson, he said at last, all that concerns the facts. But there is a thread which binds this matter to me alone, a thread I would sooner have left unbroken. He rose and paced the room with a restless energy I had come to associate with his rare moments of personal doubt. The man who fell in that duel was not merely a rival, nor merely a suspect to be removed for the greater good of the Empire. He was, for a brief time, the closest thing I had to a friend. I confess this startled me. Holmes had spoken so often of the cold necessity of logic, the impersonal beauty of pure reason, that I had never imagined him capable of such an attachment. And yet here it was, admitted in the quiet of our sitting room, beneath the shadow of a case 30 years gone. He was brilliant, Watson, Holmes continued. Not in the way you or I would recognize, not in the science of deduction, but in the darker arts of deception. He played a dozen sides against each other and made himself indispensable to each. When the truth of his treachery became known, I was given a choice: expose him or bury him. His voice was steady, but I knew the cost of those words. I chose silence, Holmes said. I arranged the duel not out of anger, nor even out of justice, but because silence was the only gift I could offer him. In death, his secrets would be safe. He stood at the window, gazing out into the mist-cloaked street below. That is why I never wish this case to resurface. There are betrayals one can survive, Watson, and there are betrayals that mark a man for the rest of his life. When Holmes had finished his account, I reached for my notebook by instinct, intending to commit the whole affair to paper, as I had done so many times before. Yet before my pencil touched the page, Holmes's hand came to rest lightly upon my wrist. "No, Watson," he said softly. "Not this time." I looked at him in surprise. "But Holmes, this is a tale that deserves to be told." "It is a tale," he replied, "that serves no one in the telling." He sank into his chair and lit his pipe, though it seemed to bring him little comfort. What purpose would it serve to expose the dead? To strip away their dignity and parade their mistakes for the world's amusement? No justice would come of it, Watson. Only curiosity and the cold satisfaction of those who delight in other men's failures. He drew in a slow breath, the smoke curling around him like the memory of the fog at that cursed manor. Some truths are like certain wounds, my dear fellow. Cleaned too often, they will only fester. Better they are left closed, even if they leave a scar. I argued no further. I had seen enough in Holmes's face to know this was no intellectual decision, no calculation of public interest. This was personal, perhaps the most personal case he had ever faced. And though my duty as chronicler tugged at me, My loyalty as his friend silenced my pen. We sat long into the night, the fire sinking to embers, neither of us inclined to speak. At last, Holmes broke the silence. "Some mysteries, my dear Watson," he said quietly, "are best left unsolved in the eyes of the world, but not in ours." He tapped the ash from his pipe, and with that simple gesture, the case was closed, not with triumph, nor with the satisfaction of justice served, but with the quiet resignation that not all victories belong to those who win them. And so, I laid my pen aside, and the door to that particular past was closed forever. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting long shadows across the room when Holmes spoke again. His voice had lost its usual sharpness. In its place was something quieter, almost reflective. "You see, Watson," he said, "there is a curious irony in such affairs. The cleverest schemes do not fail because of complexity, but because of something far simpler, human nature itself. When a man builds a ghost to frighten others, he inevitably forgets that he too must walk the same haunted halls." He leaned back, fingers steepled, gazing into the fire. It was not the cipher, nor the duel, nor the veil of 30 years that gave him away. It was the scent of jasmine. He had relied too much on fear, and too little on the senses. A man can bury his past, Watson, but not his habits. He allowed the silence to settle before offering a final thought. "Some mysteries, my dear fellow, are meant to be solved in solitude. Not for the world's amusement, but for the understanding of a single mind. That is justice enough." Before we close this case for good, Holmes and I leave you with a question worthy of your own deduction. In your opinion, what was the single greatest mistake made by the criminal in this case? Was it the use of the perfume, the staged haunting, or perhaps the decision to draw Holmes back to the very house he could never forget? We would love to hear your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed stepping into the fog-laden world of Sherlock Holmes, be sure to subscribe for more untold cases. Share this story with your fellow mystery lovers, and join our growing community of Holmes enthusiasts who believe that every clue matters and no puzzle is beyond solving. The game is always afoot, so let us hear your deductions.